Hi guys, this is just a topic from the lecture on Tuesday regarding practice, and we're going to go over the things that we didn't quite get time to do. And I think this is the most important part of the whole lecture, so make sure you're taking notes as we go through. If there's any questions or if you have any queries as we go through, write them down and wait till the end of the video. If by this point we haven't answered your question, just drop me an email. I'm more than happy to go through it with you like that. Okay, so sometimes when we're coaching athletes and performers, it's much better to break down the skill a little bit, particularly if we're working with someone who's in the cognitive stage of learning. Before we make this decision whether we're going to break down the skill or not, there's a couple of things that we need to think about. So if we use the example of a tennis serve for now, there's 3 bullet points that we can use to help us make this decision. So we need to do analysis of the skill itself. So how many parts are there? If it's a serial skill, they tend to work quite well being broken down in some way. Okay, they can be part practiced. And there's lots of different methods we can employ to compensate for this part practice model. When I say part, I just simply mean we're not just going out there and practicing the skill as a whole as we would do in the target environment. Okay, so if we evaluate the skill on the continuum of skill complexity from high to low and organisation from high to low. Okay, so this basically just means is how complicated the skill is and how organised it is. So those of you who attended the seminar on Tuesday would know that we covered the whole part whole method of practice. Okay, what's really important about the whole part whole method of practice is we practice the skill as a whole, so that's us completing the tennis serve as we would do. We then break it down in some way and then we put it back together again at the end and practice the skill as a whole again. And this is really important. If we don't do this last part where we put the skill back together again, it's particularly an ineffective way to learn. Okay, as a coach or as a teacher, as a therapist, if we're not putting the skill back together at the end, the performer's not going to be able to do that as well. So with our tennis serve, if we look at the diagram on the left hand side, you could easily break the tennis serve down in several parts. We've got the grip, we've got the stance, we've got the backswing, ball toss, forward swing, ball contact and follow through. So there's lots of little parts that we can break this down into. And again, to help us decide whether it's better to keep the skill as a whole or to break it down, we need to think about the organisation and the complexity, how complex it is. Okay, so a tennis serve is quite a smooth action, it needs to be quite fluid, however it's a very organised skill. Okay, each of these stages needs to be completed in a certain order to get to the end point. So in this instance, it would be good to break this down into a whole part whole method. If this was a skill such as jumping, which is a complicated skill in the fact it requires a lot of coordination, however, the order so much isn't as important, we wouldn't break this down into the whole part whole method. If you think about how you'd break down a vertical jump or a jump shot in basketball, it's actually very difficult, and that's because it's a discrete skill. So as I've said before, if you're thinking of doing a serial skill for your presentation, breaking the skill down to the whole part whole method is probably going to be the best option for you. Make sure that you have some research to justify the decisions that you're making, and use the theory from the literature and the lectures to help you make that decision. Pause. So when you've made the decision as to if you're going to do whole practice or whole part whole practice, that's essentially the hardest bit made. Okay, the next thing as a coach or as a teacher or someone designing a session needs to do is think about how you're going to break it down, and there's several ways that we can do this. When you've been performing and going to your own coaching and training in your own time, you're probably going to recognise some of these methods that your coach uses on you, or you might have delivered yourself. Okay, so essentially this is going to go through the theory as to why, which you probably haven't quite thought of before. So one way we can practice part of the skill is by taking a segmentation approach, where we practice section A and then move on to section AB and then finally section ABC. Okay, so this is the exact same image that I had on the previous slide, And all I've done is I've broken it down into chunks. And as we can see, the complexity of the skill, or we're adding on an extra bit at the end each time. So in the first phase, we're practicing getting our racket in the right position and leaning back. So we'll practice that movement maybe 5 times, for example. Section B, we can see, is that middle image there with the additional 2 phases. Okay, so we're coming through with the follow through of the arm, coming up to a swing. But what's important is we're not practicing those last 2 phases on their own. Okay, we've added them onto the first bit. So these 2 images here are the exact same as these 2 images here. We've just added this bit on. And then finally, section C, which is just these 2 additional phases here, we've added on to the end of the skill. So our performer practices section A, then section AB, and then section A, B and C all together at the end. This is something that I see all the time when I teach dance routines to kids. Okay, so in 1 week what I might do is teach them the verse, so the dance to the verse of a song, and this would be section A. Okay, at the end of the session, put on a nice performance for the parents, everything's really well. The week after, I'll teach them the dance routine to the chorus, say. So I'll teach them just the chorus, and then parents come, see it at the end, very good. And then for the final concert, what I'll do is I'll get them to do the verse and the chorus and present both of those pieces together to the parents. Because in between week 1 and 2, I didn't practice this accumulation of the verse with the chorus, okay, which is the important thing with the segmentation approach. When it comes to week 3, what the girls can't actually do is it will get to the end of the verse and then they have no idea about what's coming next because we haven't practiced that transition. And that's what's really important about the segmentation approach, is that you're practicing linking the movements together. Okay, so another way we can simplify or make the skill easier to learn is by simplification. Okay, and this simply just involves reducing the difficulty of the whole skill or specific parts of the skill. Okay, so this could be, if it's a throwing event or a hitting event, it could be simplifying an aspect of that. Excuse me. Reducing the speed is sometimes a good way to make it more simple and then gradually increase the speed, bringing it up. Reduce the attentional demands of the skill, and there's several examples we can use here. Okay, so if this is the hitting skill, we can put this on a tee, like in the image on the right there. We've got a baseball on a baseball tee, and this will help the performer get a general idea of where he needs to make contact with the ball, roughly what height from the floor, okay, and things like that. In juggling, we've got our chap here who's juggling 5 balls. It might be advisable to start with 2. Maybe 3, but 2 is sometimes a better place to start. So we're reducing the complexity of the skill to begin with to help the performer learn. So alternatively, a lot of the skills that I teach, again we're coming back to a dance and gymnastics background, have a rhythmic component to them. Okay, so if I was to simplify something for someone that I coach or someone that I train, what I might do is add an auditory cue to that. Okay, and this is really interesting. So although I'm adding an additional stimuli to the performance or for the skill to be learnt, it's going to make it easier for my performer. So what I mean by that is if you are doing a dance to a piece of classical music that doesn't have a distinct hard beat to it as what a drum and bass piece might do, is I might emphasise that by counting loudly over the top. Okay, so if I'm teaching a group of girls a certain routine, to begin with we will just practice the dance to the count, so 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. When they've done a good job at performing it to the right rhythm, we'll bring the music in, but then sometimes I'll continue to count over the top of the music, which makes it more complicated for the performer because there's a lot more information going on, but it helps. It will make the routine easier and make that rhythmic component better for the gymnast. If every of you have seen a ballet dance class on YouTube or something like that, sometimes you'll see the teacher or the choreographer get irate at the dancers when they're not performing properly, and they'll start clapping or they'll stamp their hands at certain points to act as a cue to tell them when to jump. Okay, so what we'll have is we'll get a bum, ba bum, okay, and that isn't involved in the target skill. Okay, we don't see that in the performance. It's additional information. But what it will do is it simplifies and it reduces the need to listen to the music. Okay, you're listening to the auditory cue of the dancer's voice. So another thing we can look at is the attention approach, and this is a little bit different. So sometimes it's not advisable to practice separate physical parts of the skill. Okay, and this is again linked to the limitation of the whole part whole method, because we're going to produce these jerky movements. We're not going to have that nice, fluid, dynamic motion. If we think of a golf swing, if you were to practice that in a whole part whole method, you can't really do that, and that's because it's so discrete. It needs to have that dynamic, that flow to the skill. So that wouldn't be good. So we're avoiding that at all costs. But if we wanted to simplify it a little bit, what we could do is separate the skill mentally. Okay? And what I mean by that is we can selectively attend our focus to one aspect of the skill. So if we think again, and I apologise, this is going to be another dance example, ballet. If you think of a simple pirouette, I say simple because it looks simple, but there's a hell of a lot of things that are going on in a pirouette. Okay, you've got to go from a two-footed stance position up onto one leg, usually on point, which is on the tip of the toe. You've got to maintain your balance when you're there, which is very difficult. A lot of people can't do this. You've got to push off with the non-standing leg, squeeze through all the muscles on the standing leg, rotate, make sure your arms are in the right position, make sure your face is in the right direction, make sure your fingers are in the right direction, squeezing every muscle in your body to make sure that you are in an upright position. Have an awareness of where you are in the world so that you know when to stop, and then land essentially. So place your foot back down, facing the right direction. There's so many things that the ballet dancer is thinking about in that one movement that happens so quickly. People really don't appreciate this. On top of that, a ballet dancer's also got a spot. Okay, so to prevent the dancer getting dizzy, she'll focus on one aspect of the room and make sure she whips her head around to focus on that one spot so that her head is moving less than the rest of her body to avoid getting dizzy. And again, that's another thing that this dancer needs to think about. Okay, so when I'm teaching ballet and I'm working with students who know the skill, we're just fine-tuning little bits of it. So this approach might be better for someone in the associative or the autonomous stage of learning. Okay, is I'll get them to attend their focus on just that one issue. So let's just say in this scenario, I have a ballet dancer who's having trouble spotting on the wall. Okay, so she's having trouble locating that one spot and whipping her head around. I don't want to break down the pirouette skill because that's going to provoke a jerky movement. Okay, so I'll say complete the skill as you would do normally. However, these couple of tries, so let's say 5 goes, I want you to really focus on getting your eye looking at this sticker that I'm going to put on the wall every time you turn around. Okay, so the ballet dancer will still perform the skill in the fluid, dynamic way that she would normally do, but she's selectively attending to, she's cognitively attending to one moment, one aspect of that skill. So we're breaking it down, but just in a cognitive way rather than an actual physical, noticeable way. So that sort of summarises all of, well, not all of the way, but the main ways that you can break down the skill. Okay, so these are some of the things you might like to think about for your presentation. If you think a whole part whole method is going to be good for your kind of skill, because it's serial in nature, then it would be a good idea to start thinking about whether you're going to have an attention approach, which is going to depend on their stage of learning, whether you're going to simplify the skill, which is going to depend on what the issue is with your video footage, or whether you're going to have a segmentation approach. Okay, so use what we've talked about here over these last couple of slides to help you decide and justify in your presentation which one of these you're using. Okay, so there's one last thing that we need to think about when we're practicing, okay, and that's how much practice we're actually doing. So we've all heard the terms practice makes perfect and 10,000 hour rule, so if you do something for 10,000 hours you can be considered an expert after this. Okay, but this might not strictly be true. Okay, so how much practice is necessary? Okay, the amount of time you dictate to it is obviously going to have an effect on this. Okay, So if we practice something more and more, is this going to make you better at your performing your skill? Okay, if you continue to practice beyond the amount needed to achieve a certain performance standard, it can actually lead to poorer retention and transfer of that particular skill. And I mentioned in the lecture, okay, that is the really important bit, okay, it's the retention of the information and the transfer between skills. There's no good being really good in the training environment unless you are able to replicate that in the actual target environment. So there's no good being able to perform copious amounts of free throws in a training facility, but then when you're out on the court, if you can't do it, then you know you're going to go to pot essentially, and you won't be picked for the next match. Okay, so it's the retention, the transfer that's key. Okay, and there is such a thing as overlearning. Okay, and overlearning is something I think is much easier to identify as a performer rather than as a coach. It's quite hard to see this from the outside without having actually, you know, felt the frustrations. Okay, and overlearning is simply the practice that continues beyond the amount of practice to achieve a certain performance criteria. And there has been research that has identified that this overlearning exists. Okay, so this graph actually shows the results of a classical piece of research. Okay, what these bars are actually showing is the amount of error at the end of the skill. Okay, so in this experiment the task was to draw a line that was 5 centimetres long in length without having a ruler, so just guessing how long that distance is. And you might have already done this in this module or a different module. Okay, so we can see here that a taller bar is not better. Okay, this is a worse performance because we're having a bigger error. We're either going way too long or way too short each time. The peach coloured bars, okay, is the results of the test at the end of the practice session, and the green bars are the results of the transfer task. Okay, so these people have been practicing drawing lines 5 centimetres long. Okay, at the end of the practice they did, you know, a post test, okay, which is the results that we see here. Okay, and then they were given the task to draw a line that was 7 centimetres long in length. Okay, and this shows how accurate they were able to do this. Along the bottom we've got how many practice trials they had, so we can see that this is increasing. We've got 42 practice goes, 77, 102, 127 and 152. So this is how many times that person practiced before they had their post-test. Okay, so we're looking at overlearning here. And there's some interesting things that we can get from this graph, okay, from this data. So if we look at how well the performers were able to draw a line that was 7 centimetres in length, we can see they got pretty good after 42 practice goes. Okay, a different group of participants after 77 goes were no better or worse than someone that had 42 goes. We can see at 102 practice goes, performance is slightly better. Okay, so we're being more accurate. This is why this isn't as high as the other bars. And then again, after this, we can see we're getting similar results to what we were getting at 42 and 77. So all of these bar heights are very similar. So one thing that you can pull out from this data is that after 152 practice goes, you are no better than what you would have been after 42. Okay, so from a performer's perspective, this is going to be a much better option, and for a coach it's going to take much less time to get the same performance outcome. So we can see by looking at these bars we're getting no better the more goes that we take, and we refer back to our definition of overlearning. So this is practice that continues beyond the amount needed. Okay, so this is an actual physical view of what overlearning would look like. Okay, so in the transfer test, so remember this is a transfer to a novel skill, so we're drawing 7 centimetre lines when we've only been practicing how to do 5. We can see the results are quite different to what they were just at the end of practice. Okay, so after 42 goes we see that we are quite inaccurate, so we're not very good at drawing 7 centimetre lines. Okay, in a different group who have practiced drawing 5 centimetre lines 77 times, we're getting identical results to what we did at the end of practice. Okay, so this performance is much better than this one because we're closer to 0 and this is the amount of error. Okay, in 102 we're getting slightly more error than what we did at 77. 127 we're getting even more error as we are at 152. Okay, so with the more goes we've had, okay, we're not any better at drawing 7 centimetre lines. The transfer of skills is much worse. Okay, so this is a slightly different scenario to what we see at the end of practice where the results don't really change. We're actually seeing this is having a negative effect, okay, and quite a dramatic negative effect on performance. So this is why we avoid overtraining, okay, because when we transfer it to a novel skill, we're not able to do it as well. So by looking at this graph, okay, we can prescribe that if we wanted to put someone into the drawing the 7 centimetre and 7 centimetre line championships, 77 practice goes is going to be most beneficial in training to get that person to be the winner, essentially, okay, because we're getting good end of practice results and very good transfer tests, whereas we don't have that with any other combination of amount of practice that we've had. Okay. So hopefully now when you hear things that say practice make perfect and the 10,000 hours rules, they are completely not true. Okay, it depends very much on who's performing the skill, what the skill's being performed, and you know, practice certainly does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect, but you need to think about all the things that we've covered in the lecture, in the seminar, and over these couple of videos. So to summarise the whole of the practice theory, okay, classification of the skill and level of the learner is going to impact the effects and organisation of how you structure your session. Okay, learning new skills takes mental and physical effort. Okay, so we need to be training the whole of the information processing model, making sure that our performers are engaged with what we are doing. What the learners prefer, so a certain style of practice, might not be what gets the best results, so this is important from a coaching perspective. Are you there for them to have fun, or are you there to make them better? You're going to have to make that decision. And methods of simplification may be necessary for optimal results. Okay, particularly if you're in the cognitive stage of learning, breaking that skill down is going to enhance overall performance of that. Okay, so start to think about all of the things that we've covered. Okay, maybe pick on 1 or 2 of them and go into a little bit more detail for your presentation. Okay, so I don't want anybody coming in to say, yeah, we're going to just make them practice. That's not going to be enough. You need to have to go on and say, okay, well, we're going to increase variability by taking shots from different areas in the D and netball. This is because it's an open type of skill, which is going to enhance their schema. Fill in the blanks, ... and that's going to get you a much better grade than if you just say, yeah, practice is good, it's going to make us better. Okay, so I've given you loads of different things to think about. You don't need to include every single one. Okay, hopefully there's something there for everybody. If not, here is your further reading. Okay, what I'll also do is I'll put a digitised chapter of the textbook on Blackboard so that everybody has access to it, because this is a really important part of your presentation. Okay, everybody needs to practice to get better, and there are the references. So like I said, if you've got any questions or queries, just drop me an email. I'm more than happy to respond to those. Okay, good luck with your presentations, and I will see you in the assessment in a couple of weeks' time.